Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give it just a couple minutes here for people to join, and then we'll begin. I will ask if you are not speaking to please make sure you have muted yourself this morning or this afternoon, whatever time of day it is. I really don't know anymore.
People. People.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the November Lunch and Learn with the League of Women Voters of Lincoln-Lancaster County. I'm Kaylee Hogan-Schnittker, Secretary of the Board. We are so glad that you have joined us today for Schools 101 with our special guest, Rachel Gibson. Before we begin, please be sure to utilize the chat function if you have questions or comments throughout the presentation. Rachel will be happy to answer those as she is presenting. So please don't hesitate to ask. We will leave a little bit of time to address them at the end as well. If you are not talking, we do ask that you mute yourself. We don't want to interrupt our speaker today out of respect for her time, as well as the time of everyone else here who has joined us. And last but not least, we will be sending out a recording for this meeting. I do apologize if you're still waiting for last month's. That's totally my fault. I will be sure to get that out with this one as well. And I think one thing that we all need to remember to do here in a few days is Election Day. So don't forget to vote next Tuesday on November 8th. I will now turn things over to our wonderful committee chair, Terry Hendrickson, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Kaylee, and welcome everyone to the November meeting of League of Women Voters Lunch and Learn. We're glad you've joined this program. It's briefly titled Schools 101 with our esteemed presenter, Rachel Gibson. I'm Terry Hendrickson, chair of the League committee that develops our Lunch and Learn series. Our committee brings important topics for discussion every first Thursday of the month. If you're interested in our work, please be in touch with me by liking our Facebook page. I've just posted that link in the chat for everyone, and send me a message via Facebook Messenger. Perhaps you'd like to join our committee. Maybe you've got some ideas for what might be good upcoming topics. Again, thanks everyone for turning off your video and your audio so we can focus on our speakers. So let's introduce Rachel. Rachel Gibson is Vice President of Action for League of Women Voters Nebraska, our statewide league. Before starting with the league, she spent 10 years as an advisor, educator, and program coordinator in higher education at institutions like the University of Kansas, Wichita State University, and Creighton University. Suffice to say, she is a lifelong learner, researcher, and she likes to share what she has learned. So please enjoy. Rachel, thank you, and take it away.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and see if I can share my screen here. All right, everybody see okay? All right. I'm also going to drop a link in the chat. This is to our resource page. So if you want to hop on and take a look, you're more than welcome to. My name is Rachel Gibson, as mentioned, and I'm the Vice President of Action. My previous role with the League was as our Director of Education Policy, and so this initiative it came out of that. So that's the origin of this. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in here. And today our topic is Schools 101. And You all are probably very familiar with the League, but when we present to community members, we always start with this, what the League is, to give kind of a concept of who we are. And we always emphasize that we're a nonpartisan group. A lot of times people think of the League as the folks who help people register to vote, which is absolutely an important part of what we do. But we also do legislative advocacy. And I actually see some of my fellow directors on the call and committee members. So hello to you all. Thanks for your work. What that means is that we look at state level policies, we review bills that are introduced, we testify at hearings, and then a big portion of what we do is actually educating the public, which is what this came out of when our action team for education got together and said, how can we be the most helpful to voters? It was to give a crash course in how education works, simply because there's a lot there and it's really important. So that's what this was born out of. As I mentioned, we have a couple other action teams. If any of these interest you, definitely let me know. We would love to have anyone join us. No education required. We'll definitely teach you what you need to know. All right. So what we're covering today, one of our wonderful team members is actually a former middle school teacher. And so she said, let's make it like learning targets, because this is how educators tend to think. So what we're going to talk about today is, the purpose. Let me go back one. The purpose of public schools, a real brief history to kind of set the scene. We'll talk about the different types of schools, and then really, or the bulk of our time, we'll talk about how Nebraska schools are funded, a little bit about curriculum, and then how parents, families, and community members impact those schools. So the first thing is this concept of what's the purpose of public schools? So if you have your chat open, throw in what do you think the purpose of public schools in the US is? It's always interesting to see the range. So if anyone wants to throw into the chat what they think of when they think of the purpose of our public schools. I'll give it a second. So an educated workforce, absolutely. That's definitely what a lot of folks think of when they think of the purpose of public schools. Other things that come to mind, or that you hear other people talking about the purpose of public schools? I'll start going through these and see if some of them prompt some thoughts here. Social interaction, perfect. Strengthen our democracy, absolutely, absolutely. Provide an education and support children. Yeah, so getting outside of just that basic academics. To give every child the best start in life. Love that. Free education for all K through 12. That's literally written in our state constitution. So yes, yes, yes. I love the different variety of things that you all are hitting on here. I'm going to keep an eye on that as we kind of walk through some of these that we hear most frequently. First of all, as mentioned, that basic education. A lot of times we think of that's, how to read your numbers, your letters, those types of things. Also that common and unifying experience. So it's something that kind of ties us all together. I always joke with Sarah, we remember parachute day. You remember in gym when we had the big parachute and you flipped it open, you sat under it and everyone's like, oh yes, parachute day. So those unifying common experiences. Yay, yes, someone else loved parachute day. It wasn't just me. But they also serve, as you all have kind of hit on, as these community service centers. Definitely during the pandemic, we saw that our local school here was the place that handed out lunches. So and everyone felt comfortable and knew they could go there because it's our community school. Someone hit on civic education. I think this is one that gets lost, but it's incredibly important and very built in the history. And then moral and societal norms, and this has changed and fluctuated through time, but even at its very base, I'm thinking of my kindergartner and just having another place that's helping him learn how to share and learn how to interact with other people. So what are the norms and those types of things? So you all have hit on some awesome things here. This is kind of the context of when we talk about schools, the breadth of what that involves. Very quickly, we're going to go through the history just because I think it's important to get a concept of how we got to where we are. So when the country first began, it was really just a mix of schools. Some places had access to schools, some didn't. Many were religiously affiliated, but it was kind of all over the place. And then as we started to put together the structure of a government, our founding fathers, and I wish more mothers, knew and understood that we needed an educated citizenry if we were going to govern ourselves. So although they didn't make it widespread, it began to integrate that idea that education is a necessary thing for our country's success. In the 1830s is really when the concept of what people think of as public education really took off. And this was the concept of the common school. And this was led by Horace Mann. If you've done any education research, you know this is Horace Mann is the guy who coined the education is the great equalizer. So this is really when that concept took off. And it started in Massachusetts as the first state that made public school universally available and state funded because they saw that it was a public good. And this is kind of the structure that we've taken forward since then. In the late 1800s, really uneven expansion, great variety. You know, Massachusetts had state funded. In rural communities, there may not even be a school, but there was this expansion as the country expanded as well. In the early 1900s was a really interesting time because for education, there was both this push and pull. So we had assimilation. When you think about a lot of the European immigrants that were coming to the United States at the time, schools were where those folks went to learn how to be an American, how to have the baseline of, you know, the things you would need to be in a workforce. While at the same time, there were some very structural ways that we were trying to segregate people and keep them separate, particularly related to race, but in other ways as well. So it was a really interesting push and pull. Moving on to the 1960s, this was kind of our next big education era. I think of it as like sort of the golden era. Like, yes, we're trying to make it more equal. This is when Brown versus Board of Education happened, which outlawed segregation of schools, racial segregation of schools. But it's also the time that we had a lot of disability rights acts that required that students, no matter what their learning ability, would have access to a quality education. So it really expanded really this concept of everyone deserves access to a quality education. And then finally, where we set the tone for where we're at today, in the early 2000s, we've kind of moved into this accountability and competition model. And as we got more technology savvy, able to do things more widespread, there's this rise of testing and this idea of, okay, if taxpayers are paying in money, what's the outcome? Testing. The No Child Left Behind Act of the Bush administration really emphasized this. And while the goal was to ensure that everyone had an equitable education across the board, it really just demonstrated some of the fissures we have in our education system. It also gave rise to a lot of different types of schools. So we really saw the rise of charter schools and private schools and different funding models for that. So that's kind of the landscape that we are in today. All right. I sometimes ramble on that, so I'm going to force myself to go forward. But if you got any questions, drop them in the chat. So that brings us to where we are today. And when our group of our action team came together, we thought, okay, there's so many school types and it's confusing. What's different? How are they the same? So we really want to hone in on how different types of education work, K through 12 education work. And there are kind of three main ways that different forms of education vary. Number one is the who can attend. Number two is the what is taught. And number three is the funding source. So I love a good chart, hence this chart. I'm sure some of the directors can tell you that. If I can put it in a box, I'm going to. So let's start with our traditional public. This is what most students attend a traditional public. Who can attend? In Nebraska, this is everyone K through 12 is supposed to have access to education. It's usually based on your place of residence. So my kids go to the school right across the street. Not always, but usually, and generally, in 99.9% of situations, students are accepted. There's some slight exceptions, but usually you are accepted at your local public school. What's taught is a basic curriculum that's set by the state board, and then the funding comes from our taxes, and we'll dig into what that looks like in a minute. As a point of clarification, charter schools, you probably hear a lot about those. We don't technically have charter schools in Nebraska. But what they are, to give some context, is that they're students, they're technically public schools. So if you look at the funding source, it's coming from taxes. The difference is that either they're adjusting who can attend or what that looks like. So it might depend on the district of if they allow students a ranking list, or you can opt in. For example, City of New Orleans, all the public schools are charter schools. So they rank what order they want to attend a school in, and that's how they sort those. And then what's taught is really what I think makes charter schools the most different. Is it's highly flexible. They're exempt from some requirement, but the exchange for that is demonstration that learning is happening. So that's one of the ways that it is very different. All right, magnet public schools. We're on our last type of public school. Again, funded by taxes. I think of magnets almost like in between traditional and charter in a way, because magnets usually have some sort of requirement of admission. Sometimes it's a mix. Sometimes it's your local school with some students from other places based on the focus of the magnet. It can sometimes be opt-in. It might be a lottery. But again, what's different with magnets is what's taught. More often than not, there's some sort of specialized curriculum. For example, my younger brother went to an arts magnet in Wichita. And so they had at least one, if not two, art classes every year, which is not typical public education, right? So it's that idea of a specific focus. All right, so those are our public schools. Now let's shift and talk private. And I've split private and religious private. I found that in the Midwest, especially here in Omaha and where I'm from Wichita, most of our schools that are private are religious, but across the board, only about 60% are religious. So they're different. The biggest difference here is that they're funded by tuition as opposed to taxes. So that's from money that parents are paying in, but it's also foundations. It's also from the archdiocese or whatever funding mechanism they have that way. As far as who can attend, that's the other big difference. Private schools are not required to accept everyone who attends. They can set requirements. So that could be based on test scores. It could be based on just filling out an application. It could be based on an essay. As you see there for religious schools, it might be based on religious affiliation or agreement to continue something in a religious capacity. So those are the two biggest differences. As far as what is taught, a lot of times private schools look very similar to public schools in curriculum, although they might have some specialized elements, some additional classes, or of course in religious schools, a religious component. So those are the two private school models. And then our last model here, I can't forget my homeschooling friends, because for a while I was homeschooled as well. And actually 3% of Nebraska students, and that number is growing, are homeschooled. So this is, if you live in your house, you can attend. What's taught is family dependent, but I do like to highlight that there are curriculum packages or products that are often sold for homeschooling, or a lot of people who homeschool use the state standards as their guidelines. And then funding for that is personal. There's no taxes or tuition with that. So any questions about kind of the setting the stage here, the history of the types of schools? I'm going to keep going, but if I see something, I'll hop in there. All right. Again, to kind of give us the big snapshot about education in the US, I think this is helpful when we talk about policy, because we often get into the nitty-gritty on things, and to give the concept of, okay, what are we talking about here? 50.7 million students are in public schools. And you can see the breakdown of K through 8 and 9th through 12th. 7% of those are in charter schools. So again, because charter schools are public schools, 7% of those students are in charter schools. And again, I emphasize that because there's so much talk about charter schools and even private schools that sometimes it's like, okay, let's step back and take a look at the bigger picture here. So similar with private schools, 5.7 million students attend private schools in the US. Now, an interesting fact here is that 25% of the schools are classified as private schools. So if you follow that to its conclusion, there are fewer students in more schools that are classified that way, which translates to things like smaller class sizes and whatnot. So that's an interesting data point. As I mentioned, 66% of private schools are religiously affiliated. Here in Nebraska, that number is much, much higher. All right, shifting to governance in public education. And I know I'm going super fast, so please throw in a question or comment if you've got it. So there's a lot of talk right now, especially around the election, about governance of education in Nebraska. So we felt like it was really important to clarify what this looks like, focused on the student. So when you look at the student in the classroom, the first kind of level of governance or the interaction they have with an adult is in their classroom. That's closest to them. So they're getting guidance from their teachers, their paras, whatnot. Then the next level was the school. So that's the principal, the different counselors, other teachers, that type of thing. That's kind of the next level. Beyond that, you have the district, the local district, school district, and district in Nebraska can mean a huge variety of things. Some districts that means one high school, other districts that means 10 high schools, but it's that geographic area that's kind of making decisions as a group. And then finally, at the next level, you have the state and the state guidance that happens. So when you think about governance, there are all these different levels. The US has one of the most decentralized systems in the world. So we're very focused locally at the local level and the state level. If you want to see the opposite of what that looks like, check out France. Theirs is very, very highly centralized. What this translates to is that the primary responsibilities, funding, authority, that happens at the state and local level, closest to the student. And when you think about this, all sorts of decisions are made at these different levels. So that could be things like staffing, which tends to be at maybe a school or a district level. Budget, that tends to be a district level decision broadly, but then you have elements in the school. Weather closures, that's a district decision. So the state doesn't say you have to close for weather, the district decides. So there's these different levels of decision making. So when we talked about this and went through this, I said to Sarah Smolin, who was the educator I mentioned earlier, I was like, okay, I intellectually understand this. Explain to me how this impacts curriculum. What does that look like? And she gave this delightful example of 7th grade English, because that's what she taught. So if we're talking curriculum, we're going to start wide. You have the state, and the state curriculum says every 7th grader in Nebraska has to complete a unit on identity, which middle schoolers should. They're figuring themselves out, right? So state level identity. The district may then take that and say, okay, we need to teach identity across all our schools. We are going to use The Outsiders as the book that we're going to use to teach identity. Then the school might sit down and the 7th grade, teaching team, the English teaching team might say, let's make sure we do this in the spring, because that'll build on the stuff we've already learned on identity. And then when you get down to that classroom level, that's when the teachers really decide how to implement that. So a particular teacher might say, we're going to have our students write a persuasive essay in the spring about the outsiders to demonstrate their ideas and understanding of identity. So this is how curriculum happens. And as you hear conversations and we talk about different governance, again, we're such a localized system that the way we get to that student and that support has multiple levels. All right, questions about curriculum or anything like that before I hop into funding? This is one where I can get kind of off the rails. Okay. So public education funding, big conversation right now in the state of Nebraska. So we're talking public education now. All public schools are funded by taxes. There are 3 different types of taxes, and depending on the state is the percentage of, a given school's budget, how much comes from these 3 different types. So the first is local taxes. Those are the primary source in almost all states, and that's usually tied to property tax. And we'll talk in a minute about why that's both a good and a bad thing. But you'll see 45%. That's the national average of how much comes from local sources. It's much higher here in Nebraska. The second level is state. That's the second largest source for most states. Usually it's about the same as the local. Again, not the case here in Nebraska. And what that comes from is it's either for general funds, it might be for specific programs, or it is for equalization, which we'll talk in depth about what equalization means in a second. But basically, it's recognizing that some schools need a little extra help, that the community doesn't have the resources to provide for the needs. And then the last funding source is federal. And this is usually the smallest source. Again, because we're such a decentralized system, it's really quite small. And they're usually provided for specific programs. So education funding really is based at that state and local level. So like I said, in Nebraska, the percentage that we, a given school's budget that comes from property taxes, I don't want to give the number because I don't want it to be wrong, but it is higher than that 45%. In fact, when you look across the country, we're 49th in state support for our schools. So we really rely on that primary source, which is property taxes. So let's talk about why you picked property taxes. The good thing about them is that it is stable. So we're not relying on sales tax or income tax. It can adjust for changes in the market a little bit easier. There's a stability there. And it also really ties back to that, let's keep it local. If a community decides they want to spend more on their schools, then they are able to choose to do that through their levy limits, their tax level. Now, the negative side of this is that property taxes are simply a reflection of a community. So there are communities that have been deemed less valuable, typically places that are low income, areas that have students and families who have been oppressed, communities of color. Those types of things have been identified as less valuable, and therefore there's less funding to work with. So that kind of gives an idea of what's good and bad about property taxes. The other thing is, in Nebraska, our property taxes are very, very high. And that is not necessarily that the tax rate for our property taxes it's high, it's that our property is valued much higher than other states, which is an interesting element. So let's talk a little bit about funding by the numbers. Let's put this in the context of the country. How do we compare? One way that you'll see things presented is often cost per pupil, or how much it takes to educate one student. So you'll see there that the average cost per student across the nation is around $13,000. Nebraska, we're at $12,000. So we're right in the middle, and you'll see the range is huge. Idaho's below 8,000, New York is above 25. So we're right in the middle of that element. Now, something I like to point out here is that private school annual tuition, because you'll hear a lot about this concept of fund the student, or fund the student, not the school, paying an amount for a specific student as a funding model. And oftentimes that gets compared to private schools. So someone might say, oh, well, the average tuition for a student who attends a private school is less than the price per student for a public school. But the problem with that is that tuition does not account for all of the money going into that student at the private school, if that makes sense. So tuition accounts for 60 to 70% of private school revenue. So there's additional funds coming from donors or the archdiocese that would make that cost per pupil actually more. So that's one piece that's an important detail. And I'm seeing over here, thank you, some people checked me here. Almost 60% of K through 12 education is in property taxes in the Lincoln area. And I'd say that's pretty true across the state. So thank you, Randy and Terry. Another note, and this is, I love this, I love learning from the group. Private schools don't usually have children with disabilities. Wonderful point, Jennifer. And I think we might get into that later, but I definitely want to make sure that that gets heard. In Nebraska, the requirement is that public schools must educate every student. That is not the same requirement of private schools. Often private schools may admit a student with disabilities, but if they don't have the resources to provide for that student's needs, those get outsourced to the public school. So I live in the West Side community in Omaha. And so we have several private schools here that I have a friend who has a child on an IEP, and someone from the West Side School District comes in once a week to work with the students at the private school. And that's on the public schools dime. So that is an important point. Thank you, Jennifer, for bringing that up. Okay. This is great. I presented this to a group of teachers once, and oh my gosh, I was like, here, you give the presentations. I'm learning so much. I love it. All right, so let's talk about public education expenses, because one of the other things we hear a lot is that we don't have a funding problem, we have a spending problem. And if you know a teacher, you probably experienced that that's not necessarily the case. And the way we look at this is where we spend the money that schools do get. And as you can see here nationally, 80% is spent on our teachers. 80% is spent on salary and benefits. It's on the actual teaching. A very small percent is spent on other types of things. And when you compare that national to local, I picked 3 districts here across the state. You'll see we stay pretty close to that, particularly Lincoln Public Schools. The majority of the budget goes to teachers, staff, benefits, those types of things. This is also a place I like to highlight that, these are our community members. So not only are we educating our students and having that benefit of it, but we're also providing a livelihood for someone in our community. So that's a really important point as well. Okay. All right, now we're going to get into the big hairy monster. That is how Nebraska funds schools. And this is perfect timing to have this conversation because particularly with the election coming up, there have been some stark differences with different candidates about how they would suggest we fund schools. So hopefully this gives some context. So you can look at those and have some insight into what they're meaning when they talk about this. So Nebraska uses a formula for financing called TIOSA, which is the Tax Equity and Educational Opportunities Act. This was first developed in the 1990s and has been tweaked beyond belief since then. Almost every year in the legislature, there's some sort of adjustment to it. The basic formula of this is that at the state level, they look at all the districts, and for each district, they calculate the needs of a district, and then they subtract the resources available to that district. And then if those don't match and there are more needs than resources, then the state steps in with this thing called state equalization. So that's the basic idea here, is they're looking at the needs, the resources, and providing. And the reason for this is to acknowledge that different districts have different challenges. If you have a good percentage of English language learners, that's a little different. If you have a rural community where the cost to run a bus is, 10 miles versus 2, that's a different need. So that was the concept behind creating this calculation. And the other thing that I always want to highlight with TIOSA and this concept of equalization is that 87 of our 244 districts have equalization funds, and they are across the state. They are truly across the state. So sometimes this gets pitted as, all of the big schools and the urban centers are getting equalization aid and the rural schools are paying it with their property taxes. That's not completely an accurate picture because, again, the equalization happens across the board. I'm also not saying TIOSA does not need to be changed. TIOSA needs some serious revisions, but I think if we're going to fix it, we need to talk about what it actually looks like. All right, this is a very complex chart, and I will send out slides so you can dig in if you want. But the big thing I want to highlight here is people will ask, okay, I get the concept that needs minus resources equals aid. What goes into that? How do you run that calculation? So you'll see here we've got the needs section, and that goes up here and tells you all the different calculation pieces that they take in for a district. So they do look at poverty. They look at focused programs. They look at how many people need summer schools and those types of things. When you look at the resources, then what they're looking at is predominantly property taxes. They're also looking at this thing called net option funding. And one thing that's really neat about Nebraska is that our public schools, a student can attend any public school. You don't have to attend the district you're in. You have the option to attend others. Now there's things that impact that, but you have the ability to. I use West Side as a great example. 30% of our students don't live in our district. They come from other districts. The state recognizes that that's an additional cost. So there's a net option funding is a little extra money for those students that we know are coming in. So needs, resources, and then equalization aid. That's where we get in there and say, okay, you need more based on your needs and what your resources are. Again, lots of things going on this page. I will share it around so you can see, but I always like to show this as, this is what we're talking about when in that calculation. Dave Welsh in the chat mentioned that in 2007, there were 205 equalized school districts. That is fascinating. Yet a great example about how TIOSA has changed over time, and also how our economic landscape has changed over time. That's very interesting. Okay, this is another one that's kind of hard to read, but I like including it because it gives you a sense of what this looks like boiled down. So right here, you'll see in Lancaster County, there are several different school districts. I know it's hard to read and I'm really sorry. Lincoln is up here at the top. It calculates how much is in needs. Then it calculates how much you're getting from property taxes. Then again, that net funding, how many for people coming in. There are a couple other things that it includes in those. And then it has that total of resources. If those don't match, that's where the equalization aid comes in. So you'll see that in Lancaster County, I'm looking over here at this equalization piece. Lincoln Public Schools does need equalization aid, but Waverly doesn't. And again, that's looking at those different needs. So this is just kind of a snapshot. I have links to all of these sources. So if you want to dig in, there's some really great links that let you look at that. Whew. All right. So that was the crash course in funding for Nebraska education. Any questions on that specific piece before we move on? All right. Oh, Dave, yes, giving us more detail here. The main reason that so many schools lost equalization was due to ag land increasing 312% from 2007 to 2021. Yeah, and it's emphasizing that residential increased 169 and commercial 175. So the valuation, so how much agricultural land played into the costs of those needs and resources had an impact. Thanks for that context. I'm gonna pick your brain sometime, Dave. All right, we'll jump in here as we kind of wrap up this last little piece here. Just to give the snapshot of K through 12 education in Nebraska, just some numbers and percentages here. Again, I really like to highlight them when you look at it, 88% of our kids in Nebraska are in public schools. So when we talk about different programs and funding, let's really focus where we need to put that effort. Schools wise, this echoes nationally that we have more schools for fewer students in the non-public sector, which again, impacts that class sizes and things like that, while also keeping in mind, when you look at the staff and the teachers, that if we're talking about students with disabilities or special needs, that those resources are being pulled from the public school in many cases. Not all, but many. All right. Just some quick fast facts here, and I like to highlight see, we need to move that special education point needs to go much earlier because it's such a good one. But I do want to highlight districts. We have 244 statewide, and this blew my mind when I looked it up. So the largest is Omaha with just shy of 52,000 students, and the smallest is McPherson with 64 students. That's such a huge range. So when you think about that in the terms of like making public policy, my goodness, does that make it complicated? So our wide variety, that's one of the difficulties of finding policy and funding that works for every district. All right. So staff in public schools, again, this one's small to read, but I'll send it around. This is great to highlight because again, the folks who are in our schools are our community members. And there are a lot of people in our schools. So when you think about, I think when I walk my kid into his kindergarten classroom, we pass the counselor who's standing outside and welcoming kids, the principal, the folks who are helping keep the school clean, the media specialists. So we have all of these different folks who are in our schools making them work and providing a living for them. So this is kind of a helpful piece to see the different types of jobs. And I will briefly touch on this. Usually Sarah does this and she does it so much better than I do. But we always do like to talk about the roles of parents and families and communities. Because again, in school, you've got your teachers, you've got your staff, but there's also volunteer organizations, the PTAs, the community groups that support those folks. And then outside of school, you've got your parents, and there's this feeling of like contention right now with necessarily some parents and some teachers, which is really unfortunate, because a lot of the way educators think about it is that your partner's in education. You want the same thing that the other person wants, is for your kid to be happy and educated. Out of school, you also have elected positions, and that happens at the state level. It also happens at the local level. And Sarah always points out that each step you take from that, the district circle we showed, is farther away from the classroom, which just emphasizes how much, we need to be listening to students and teachers about what the real problems in the classroom are, what the real needs are in the classroom and in the schools. So she always gives that plug of, let's think about students first, and then the feedback from teachers is kind of a close second. And then, as you all know, strong community schools make strong communities. So economically it does, just from social programs it does, and just from general feeling a sense of community and well-being and safety in our own communities. Okay, I know I talk fast and I apologize, but I want to definitely make sure we have some time here for questions before we have to wrap it up. So does anyone have any specific questions or additional things you'd like to add, things you're curious about with the next legislative session coming up? I'm gonna stop sharing my screen there. Oh, Terry, I can't hear you. All right. Well, then I will make one other plug. Thank you so much for the time to share. Hopefully there was some good information. I know it was a lot. I will send around the slides so you can dig in if you'd like. It has a great page of resources. If you're interested in, if there's another organization that you're a part of, or even a group of friends that you would want to know this information, you can request a presentation on our website, or you can just send me an email. Our goal really is for as many people in the state to be educated about how our schools work in a nonpartisan way. So please feel free to email me or go through that request form. Oh, I see a question popped up. Talk about the role of the state board education and relationship to the public school curricula and the controversy going on this year. Oh boy. So the state board over the past year and a half in Nebraska is actually what got us started on this project, because there seemed to be a lot of people that were really worked up. And as our team started talking, we were like, I don't think we totally understand how this works. In Nebraska, in the past 2 years, there has been on the state level, the development, this started with our health curriculum. There's been the development and update of health education, which includes sex education. And there was some pretty serious pushback about what was included in that education, as for sex education, that piece of it. And it just kind of exploded from there. And so it became really contentious board meetings. There was lots of yelling from all sides. It was wild. But it, again, kind of really took that into a space that wasn't anymore talking about what the standards were, or what's best for students. and what the research showed. So that was the initial piece. And then as a larger context, we kind of have a perfect storm here in Nebraska, because this was also at the same time that there's kind of been a national movement to ask about what's being taught in classrooms. You might have heard things about CRT, critical race theory. And so that kind of melded into this health standards argument and has morphed into a larger sort of, you'll hear it talked about as parents' rights, to know what's being taught in curriculum and that type of thing. From the angle of actually looking at policy and how our system functions, our parents already have quite a bit of access to what's taught in the classroom. Most teachers post that. All teachers that I've worked with would be more than happy to talk to parents about that. So there's an oversized focus on this, how much the state board and curriculum is putting on teachers. And what we're trying to also do is kind of educate to say, okay, let's start talking to the teachers. That was all over the place and not very eloquent. We did a recent interview, Sarah and I, with Riverside Chats on KIOS. So if you're curious about more detail about what that looks like, that's an hour-long conversation that really gets into that. And there has been the other piece with that, I will say, there's been a concentrated effort that tied this kind of grassroots thing that was happening in Nebraska to a national organization that leans anti-public school and really does lean into these sort of cultural wars issue that has now, they've melded, and there's funding for some of our candidates for different boards. So it's important to look at those different candidates. And if anyone has something to add on that, please feel free.
I've given this another shot. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. Well, Rachel, you're so well-versed in all of this. We're going to encourage people to put some more questions in the chat. Thanks for bearing with me while I dialed in once again. But Rachel, this is amazing research and work assembling all of this, and you're able to synthesize it so incredibly well. We would appreciate having some of these slides after so we can distribute them.
Absolutely.
While people are putting more questions in the chat, I want to take a moment to let you know about next month's Lunch and Learn, which will be Thursday, December 1st. We're hosting a panel discussion with those in Nebraska who focus on health care, specifically abortion care. League of Women Voters of the United States believes that public policy must affirm the constitutional right of privacy of the individual to make reproductive choices. The League also believes that every U.S. resident should have access to a basic level of quality health care at an affordable cost, including abortion. So I am going to share a piece here in the chat. If you have interest or would like to explore further, I just placed a link in our chat, which gives us information about impact issues and policy and so forth. League of Women Voters of the U.S., of which our local league takes part.
Terry, I see it.
Thanks to everybody for being.
Thanks to
everybody for being a voter. We've already said we will. We've already encouraged everybody to take part in the process by voting. If you're interested in becoming part of the league and helping us register voters and so forth, again, please be in touch with us. I'll place my direct email in the chat. So if you want to be more involved in the Lunch and Learn series that we have here that we're hosting, or become a member, let us know. So without any further ado, thanks for letting me do a commercial.
Sure. I see, and it gave people time because I see a bunch of questions here, which is great.
Yep. Please
all
go
right.
ahead. And
Thank you. Thank you. So I'll try to be succinct, which, as you can tell, is not my strong suit. Question, is there reasoning for not using public tax dollars for private religious schools, the religious indoctrination or establishment of a particular doctrine? Such a great question. So there is a bill that has come the past, I think it's 4 or 5 years, called Opportunity Scholarship, that we often have this conversation about. It's a very roundabout way of getting essentially public dollars to private schools. It's nuanced, but that's the general concept. And the pushback against that is there are several different pieces of it, but the biggest ones are, number one, yes, there's that element of religious separation of church and state piece, that's public money going to a private organization that could push a specific religious agenda. But really, another huge piece of that is, if you remember back to our little chart, private schools don't have to accept all students. So to have public dollars go to organizations that could refuse admissions to students based on a wide variety of things, sometimes based on a social issue or that type of thing. I think of our LGBTQ plus students that could be denied admission, or the requirements of what they do when they're there. Like I said, some schools might require you to attend church every week or that type of thing. That's not the same availability and access that is for all public schools. The other piece is the accountability piece. Private schools don't have the same accountability and rules that public schools do. And so that's a really important piece of that, in addition to the separation of church and state piece, about those public dollars going to private schools. Okay, hopefully I answered that one. Can you speak to the pressure being put on school librarians to prohibit or ban books? Yes, oh my goodness, I feel so bad for our media specialists right now. Because as you mentioned, as we talked about a bit ago, there's a huge push about what books can be included and available to students. And that is, we're seeing it on two fronts really. One is, again, referred to as CRT. So this is books that challenge racial ideas or use language that is historically accurate, but inflammatory now. And then the other side is that LGBTQ plus, or even just like sexual identity and sexual growth, having themes in that area. So those are two areas we see folks really wanting to push a ban. The difficulty, especially here in Nebraska, that is frustrating to watch, is that most of the fervor is unfounded, because some of the books that they point to don't exist in our libraries currently. And that's not even to the next step of, librarians and child development folks and teachers have an expertise on what helps with child development and that type of thing. So there's a lot of pressure being put on our librarians and our school leadership as well. They're just trying to teach and stay out of the dogfight, and it's getting harder and harder. Let's see, we talked about separation of church and state. Ooh, Randy asked, does the League of Women Voters have a position on the voter ID requirement? Yes, we do. And if someone else from the league wants to jump in, because they're more well-versed than I, the stance is against voter ID, because the research tells us that it disenfranchises voters, makes voting harder, and particularly certain communities, again, communities of color, underrepresented and repressed communities. So that's the official stance on that one. Okay, Charlene asks, what are the cost and benefits of per pupil state aid? Okay, so per pupil state aid is, we're talking about that idea that it costs so much across the board to educate a student. Let's just give the student $10,000 and they can go wherever they want. So some good things about that is this idea that it gives students choice. It also has, I'm trying to say this in a not biased way just because I know the research, but it has the illusion of equity to it. But some of the downsides is that it doesn't take into account a lot of those external factors that influence the ability of those students to use that funding in a way that really does equalize education. So it doesn't recognize that. The other thing that I always highlight with this one, which I think is fascinating, and this shows my background in higher ed, is that when you move to if you move to paying the person, which is what we did with student loans in higher ed, we moved so that the funding went with the federal loans went with the student instead of directly to the school, which in theory sounds great. You can pick where you want to go. But it's also kind of how we ended up in this loan situation, because then it becomes an arms race of the schools to recruit those students. And it becomes almost a commodification of that education. So it's going to kind of exacerbate those differences of schools that are able to provide more things and more benefits that that students can take their money to versus places that don't have those resources. And you're going to kind of stratify that even more. There's a lot more to per pupil, but I would say those are kind of the big ones. And Charlene, I know that's an area you're familiar with, so please feel free to add to that. Whew, did I get it? Did I get them all? I think I did. Oh, thank you. I didn't do it wrong. All right. Any last questions?
No, I think you did great. Unless we have one more quick question, I think we're closing in on the hour that we've allotted for this. I'm just going to share my personal email that I use for league work as well for anyone who's interested in participating on our committee or joining our local league. Thanks again sincerely to Rachel, who has devoted a very good portion of her life to preparing for doing all kinds of education work, and this represents a lot. You've given us a great bit of information here and things to think about. We will be sharing this on our League of Women Voters page, so you can access it shortly. And just want to remind everybody to vote again next Tuesday. And with that, we are adjourned. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you all. You were wonderful.